Welcome back. We are continuing with Unit 7 on drugs. Essential question 2. We have 2 of them. We will be listing and describing the 6 presumptive tests used in field drug testing. And second, we will be generalizing the steps to identifying drugs. Some of our vocabulary that we're going to be looking at. We want to look at the acronym PDR. We want to know what a field test is, presumptive test, confirmatory test, chromatography, marquee testing, Duquesnoy-Levine testing, the Dilly-Copenhague test, the Van Eyck test, and the Scott test. Based off of last week's drug quiz, I've decided to add an extra resource to you for taking notes while you guys are doing remote learning. So if you will look on your Google Classroom, you will find the new drug skeleton notes with some highlighting there. Your job is going to be to fill in the highlighted areas as you are taking notes using the video. So on these, you just type right over that and you can type in the definitions. You're going to notice that highlighting is going to be referencing what I find important and will probably be on the test. On the left, the focus questions are also completed for you, but you will need to answer them. So I do want you guys to pay attention to this. This should be a resource that you have readily available when you are taking your quizzes, as they are now open note quizzes. You'll notice that we have 6 focus questions, almost 2 pages. And then you're going to summarize your learning here. This can be done online, but you do want to make sure that you have access to it when you are taking your quiz. So let's go ahead and continue on with the notes. So our first thing we want to do is we want to look at what are the 3 ways a drug can be identified. The first way is if you have a known pill, for example, maybe a Tylenol or even a prescription pill like Vicodin, you can use what's called the physician's desk reference. This is a large volume-based book. It is published annually. And inside of it, it has things like the description of the pill, what it does, side effects, chemical formulas, reactions, etc. So this would be used for known pills. For example, if you were to pull a person over and they have a prescription bottle in their car, you want to know what it is. You can pull that prescription up, use the PDR, and compare your pill based off of its appearance. The second type of test would be known as a field test. A field test is a type of presumptive test. So you should notice that the word presumptive here and field test, these are the same thing. Presumptive is going to sound very much like the word presume. And presume, so here we are, means to assume or kind of guess or assume that you know what a certain thing is. So with presumptive testing, we are assuming the identity of a drug based off of a result that we get at the actual crime scene. So this can be done by police officers at the crime scene, or we do these preliminarily in drug labs. And they're going to allow us to speculate what that drug is. But it is not going to confirm the identity of that drug. It's just going to tell us that that drug might be present. Doesn't tell us the quantity, doesn't tell us the purity. And so one problem with a field test is that it does offer itself up to what is known as a false positive. So with a false positive, that means that you test the drug and you end up with a positive for a certain substance when in reality it is not that substance. So obviously, if you are a defense attorney, you are going to want to highlight the possibility for a false positive. And if you are on the prosecution side, you want to make sure that you are moving on to your third test so that you don't have any type of questions as to what your suspect has. And that third test is known as the laboratory or the confirmatory test. And again, confirmatory has that root from confirmation. And so when we're confirming something, we are conclusively identifying that drug. And in this case, we can do purity testing, things like that. So it is, for the most part, as close to 100% of a confirmation as we can get in the laboratory setting. The one up here on the top, just want to point out to you, is what is known as a microcrystalline test. A microcrystalline test is a type of presumptive or field test where a crystal precipitate is formed at the bottom. And we're going to talk about this particular test This one is known as the marquee test. And so a crystal will form at the bottom, and then we will also see a color change. In this case, it looks like a brown color. Down here, and we're going to do this in class, but if you want to come back when this class kind of resumes, you can try this out. But this is a type of confirmatory test, and this is going to use a device known as a spectrophotometer that will identify your drug based off of light absorbed or reflected. So let's move on to the specific tests. So as I noted earlier, physician's desk reference is going to be used to identify manufactured pills. These are legally manufactured pills. Very important that you guys know that. These are produced by pharmaceutical companies. These are not pills that are created by cooks or by drug dealers. These are going to be pills, tablets, capsules, and I should have really included syrups as well because cough syrups are also included in that. For example, codeine. The physician's desk reference is updated annually. It is a very quick and easy method of identifying legally manufactured drugs. Your doctor will have this usually on hand, and it is now online resource as well, so it's no longer this huge book you have to carry around. It is going to give you a picture of the drug. So when we look at that, we want to notice that we get a picture of that drug. We are going to know whether or not this is a prescription or an over-the-counter drug. So is this something you can pick up at Target? Over the counter next to the Band-Aids, or is this something that your doctor has to prescribe to you? If it is located on the Controlled Substances Act 1 through 5, it will also list that, and it will list which substance or which controlled substance category it falls into. Not necessarily the penalties. You would have to go to the Controlled Substances Act to figure that part out. And then it's going to tell you details of effects. So details of effects would be like what are side effects, what are drug interactions, what are possible overdose quantities, or what drugs would you not want to mix together in order to cure a patient. You don't want to give them any more symptoms or possibly side effects. So that's the physician's desk reference. And again, it only works for manufactured pills that are manufactured legally. So what if we find powders, liquids, unknown tablets? We're going to use one of two presumptive or screening tests. Again, we're going to see a couple of different words here. We see presumptive. We know presumptive is linked to field testing. So that's one of our possibilities. We see screening test. And again, that's just another type of field test. So presumptive, screening, field test. Those three words are often interchangeable. And it just really kind of depends on where the test is taking place. So the first type of test that we're going to look at is known as the spot or the color test. And that spot or that color test is shown here in this little container known as a spot plate. Each of these they're little bowls or little depressions. They are known as wells. And we will test our drugs usually in lines or columns. So we're going to test a certain drug, usually going either vertically all the way across, that same type of drug. So if I have amphetamines, let's say, I may want to test all my amphetamines here. I might want to test my barbiturates here. Maybe I have some cocaine or suspected cocaine. But my point being is that these are very organized, so you can't just randomly go, oh, I want to put cocaine here, I want to put cocaine there. It's not done that way. Usually you test your unknown. You have a reagent control or a negative control, and then you have a known control that is placed right underneath it. And so what we do is we usually test them in these vertical lines. The second type of test is known as a microcrystalline test. A microcrystalline test is going to be conducted in a test tube, or a smaller test tube is known as a cuvette. But this test tube area is going to be here. You will put your sample at the bottom of the test tube, and you're going to add your reagent to the test tube. Give it a little shake. You're going to notice a reaction that's going to take place. In this particular reaction for microcrystalline, you are going to see a crystal that's going to be produced inside of that test tube that was not there previously. So if that crystal shows up, we call that a microcrystalline test, and that is known as a precipitate. So we would call that precipitate. See if I can actually just type it in here, insert a word box for you. And so that precipitate is going to be that crystal that is formed at the bottom. See if you can see that better. And so that is that right there. Now, these tests, like I said earlier, while they are very useful for for having probable cause to arrest someone, they are not going to be able to ride you to the courtroom. You're going to have to move on to what we call confirmation testing or confirmatory testing. And again, we have two there. We have spectrophotometry and we have mass spectrometry. Now, before either one of these tests can be done, we have to have an intermediate test known as chromatography. So again, we see chromatography coming back into the forensics lab. This is paper chromatography. We would probably not do paper chromatography for this. We would do gas chromatography, which is shown here. And I'll go into more detail with that in EQ3 when we talk about confirmation testing. But this confirmation testing requires that each portion of the drug or each ingredient of the drug is divided. So you cannot have a mixture when doing confirmation testing. You have to have the mixtures separated, and then each separate component is tested and identified in that way. So that's a little bit different. When presumptive testing, we can just put the whole thing in to the test well. In confirmation testing, you will not have false positives. They are very rare. All right. So let's look at a spot test. You would have done this lab in class. I'm probably going to do it for you guys as a demo in our next meeting so that you can see how to do this. But in a spot test, you will get, let's say you have a street sample. So if you look at the upper left-hand corner here, we have a street sample. A lot of times people think the drugs have to be pure white. That is often not the case, as they are made with household chemicals, things of that nature. They're mixed or cut with other types of chemicals. So we have a street sample that perhaps we think it is, maybe we think it's amphetamines. We want to know for sure, is it amphetamine? So what we're going to do is we want to make sure we're matching the right test to the right reagent. So I'm going to go down here really quick. So I think it might be an amphetamine. So I'm going to use my chart down here. So if I think it's an amphetamine, I'm going to want to try using the Marquis test. So we see over here, I'm going to be using this Marquis test or this Marquis reagent to test for amphetamine. So let's go back to my spot plate. What I'm going to do here is I am going to take my street sample and I am going to place a very small amount into well 1 right here. And then over here, I'm going to take my Marquis reagent and I'm going to add a few drops of Marquis reagent also into well 1. Now, if it's an amphetamine, or if it's just Marquis reagent in general, I'm looking for one of two things. Marquis reagent will react with 2 different drugs. So going back to our table, the Marquis reagent is going to interact with heroin. In the case of heroin, it's going to turn purple or some kind of variation of the color purple. If it's reacting with an amphetamine, it's going to turn red, orange, or brown. So if I see this kind of family of red, orange, and brown, then I know I have an amphetamine. If I see purple, then I know I have heroin. If I see no color change, then I don't have either one of these, and I want to proceed to a different test. So going back to this picture, I've put my street sample into my well, and I've put some Marquis reagent also into that well, and I'm going to note what color it changes. So let's just say, for the sake of conversation, I get orange. So I place that liquid into that well, and I get an orange spot. What is it? Not really sure yet. So what I do want to do, though, since I'm going to eventually have to take this to court, is I do want to make sure I have a couple of controls in place. So I'm going to take that same Marquis reagent with nothing in the well, and I'm going to place it into well 2. This is a control. This is basically showing me what is the original color of the Marquis reagent when it is not reacting with anything. This is important because I want to be able to note what does a positive look like. So In this case, I'm not even going to draw it. A positive for the marquee reagent with nothing present is a clear liquid. The second control I'm going to do is I'm going to take a known sample. So if I suspect that this is amphetamine, I am going to take a known sample of amphetamine and I am going to place it into well 3. So now I have my white powder in well 3. I'm also going to add some of my reagent, my marquee reagent also into well 3. And this is a control, so that means this is a known substance. This is a known substance, so we should get a known reaction. I have known amphetamines. So I have known amphetamines here, and I have known marquee reagent here. So I expect to see red, orange, or brown. Back to my experiment. Those two are combined, and I get an orange spot. So now what I've been able to do is I've been able to identify that this known reaction of amphetamine matches this unknown reaction with the same color, and so I can assume that my street sample is also an amphetamine. If this had turned a different color, I would have had to do another test. So maybe I would do a Van Erck test, the Dilly-Copenhagen, something like that. And let's look at our chart. For your test, you definitely want to know which test reacts with which drugs and what does the positive color look like. So as I said before, a positive marquee test will turn purple in the presence of heroin. So we see heroin and purple. So purple heroin. We see red or orange amphetamines. And that's it. So marquee only reacts with heroin or amphetamines for the purpose of your test. Our second test, known as the Duquesnoy-Levine test, is going to turn blue or violet and only in the presence of marijuana. So if our suspect has marijuana, we're going to test that. And it's not always going to look like a plant base. It could look like a lot of different variations. So don't be tricked into thinking, oh, it has to be a plant. It's obvious. It's not always obvious. But any of that marijuana is going to react with a blue to violet, a dark purple, test in the presence of the Duquesnoy-Levine. If it is not blue or violet in that substance, then we know that we have a negative test for marijuana. Our third test, the Dilly test, is going to turn purple in the presence of this depressant known as the barbiturate. So if we see a purple test with our Dilly test, then we know we have this depressant on hand. Van Erck test will turn blue to purple in the presence of LSD. And Scott test will turn blue to purple in the presence of cocaine. So a lot of these drug tests can now be purchased over the counter at CVS, Rite Aid, Target, whatever, Amazon. And they do operate very similarly to the spot test that you guys have seen here. And they're just basically an at-home version of that. So I did purchase one on Amazon, so you guys can see that in our next video. So now we have our positive field test or a positive presumptive test. What next? What next is going to be chromatography. So we're going to take that sample and we're going to take it back to the lab where we're going to separate it into its components or into its ingredients. Again, we're going to revisit that mobile phase where we're going to have that mobile phase is going to be soluble, hopefully soluble with the mixture that we are trying to separate. For drug testing, we are not going to be using liquid or thin layer chromatography. We're going to be using gas chromatography. So the mobile phase in gas chromatography is a inert gas. The word inert means that it is not reactive. So it will not combine with the mixture. We are going to force that through. The column, again, looks very different than before. We see kind of going through the spiral. And then it's going to be detected here into its separate components. And so we'll revisit that again in EQ3. We'll be looking at the graphs that are produced. But basically what we're going to see here is a small version of this graph. Each of these peaks is going to represent one of the spots that we looked at when calculating retention factor. So instead of looking for component spots, we will now be looking at component peaks. And so we're going to get a graph. Why is this important? Because the Confirmation testing cannot take place until your drug is separated. So it's very important that drugs are separated before they can be fully identified. Our last part is going to be what happens if your person doesn't have the drug on them anymore. Maybe they've already consumed that drug. Maybe we have someone that's overdosed on a drug. What next? At the coroner's office, we are going to be performing the autopsy. And during that autopsy, we will be looking at lots of different body components or bodily fluids that we can test to see whether or not a person has been under the influence. So some of those components are going to be bile, secreted by that pancreas. We can look at your urine. So urine testing is what we would use if we were doing over the counter, or perhaps you were doing a drug test with a physician. A urine test would be fine for that. Hair, we talked about back in Unit 4. For hair, we could pulverize that hair and separate that, looking for those markers. Gastric contents, fancy word for what's in your stomach. So we're going to see, is there any remnant of that drug still there? We could do blood testing, we see down here. And blood testing is going to allow for a little bit longer of a drug test. Again, hair we know can stay in there. Drugs can stay in there for a few months. Urine is usually a few days. Blood, same, a few hours to a few days. Blood, a few days. Liver tissue, a little bit longer. Now, if you look at liver tissue, brain tissue, kidney tissue, spleen tissue, and especially vitreous humor of the eyes, all of these components are going to be done at autopsy. Generally speaking, a live specimen or a live person is not going to voluntarily offer up their liver tissue. So again, this would be done during surgery, but in this case, the surgery is generally the autopsy. So again, we're looking at that liver tissue, brain tissue. Okay, again, a little bit of that will be extracted. Kidney tissue, same thing. We'll take a small slice of that. Spleen. For the vitreous humor of the eye, if you're not familiar with this, this is your eyeball. Behind that eyeball, you have a fluid. That fluid basically kind of keeps your eyeball nice and plump. And so what we can do is we can insert a large needle into the eyeball, withdraw this fluid, and that fluid is going to be able to tell us whether or not you have had drugs in your system. This is also used for drowning victims. We can also tell if somebody passed away due to drowning or if they were placed into a body of water after death, using the vitreous humor of the eye. And basically what we're looking for is that if you ingest something, you drink it, what's going to happen is that will become part of the eye. So we'll see that kind of part, that fluid in there, and it's going to basically show us that drug present in your eye. And so to sum it up, to kind of go back to your EQ, you wanted to make sure you have your 6 presumptive tests, and we see our 6 presumptive tests. So we have the Marquis, the Duquesnoy-Levine, the Dilly-Copigny, 4 Van Erck, 5 Scott, and if you're missing the 6th test, it's your PDR, Physician's Desk Reference. So those. And then when we generalize the steps to identifying the drugs, if we have a pill on us, we can start with the PDR. If not, we're going to go to field test. So our first step is going to be field test. Field tests are then going to be turned into chromatography testing. And finally, that turns into confirmation testing using your spectrophotometer. And that concludes our essential question.